Hello and welcome to the West Ham Breakdown podcast with me, Callum Goodall, and my friend Darcy Cox, where today there's no football to discuss. We've done the awards, there's no games, hallelujah, but there is a huge summer ahead. We've spoken a lot about how important this summer's going to be, and before we really can get involved in any sort of transfer discussions or address any sort of rumours, we need to really think about what the squad needs. Right off the bat, this isn't going to be a in and out type video. It isn't going to be should this person stay, should this person go, who's leaving, who's staying. What we're trying to work out is what profiles of players do we need specifically, but also do Premier League teams need nowadays to compete at a level that we want to be competing at. So yeah, it's not going to be as simple as number one on the team sheet is X. Should he stay? Should he go? Should we sell? Should we buy? It's going to be more sort of macro level, I suppose, which should hopefully make for an interesting debate. But quickly, Darcy, as a bit of an icebreaker, I guess, as a bit of an opener, the Premier League season is concluded. There's been a lot tactically, I think, this season that has been interesting. I think we've seen the rise of counter-attacking teams, direct teams in Bournemouth and Forest having quite a lot of success this season. Focal point number 9s are back. Physical dominance has been the order of the day, both in midfield and defence. So I wonder, sort of, before we really hone in on what West Ham sort of either have or lack, on a more broad Premier League level, what sort of profiles would you say, if you were sort of in charge of a Premier League club this summer, what sort of profile of player would you say are sort of absolutely fundamental to having any level of success next season?
I think the overall, for lack of a better word, the overall meta of Premier League football has really shifted towards the physicality. And I know that's kind of boring and not tactical, but I think all of the most successful teams have been the teams that have been able to cover ground really well or exploit teams like, not Palace, Forest, for example, who it might not be physicality in terms of covering a load of ground, but in terms of having players who are able to sprint up the field, having those really high level physical upsides, I think is becoming more and more important. And that's in midfield, but also at the back as well in terms of being super strong and physical. It's even more important now with the rise of focal nines, as you said. And then profiles further up the pitch, in the middle of the pitch, you always want more technical players in the middle of the pitch, but I think it's becoming really key to have good decision makers in the middle of the pitch because you're getting swarmed a lot of the time because of the increased physicality and intensity of the Premier League. So players who can make decisions quickly and have speed of thought and then can marry that with their technical ability, really valuable in the middle, something we're definitely lacking at West Ham as well. And then the last one is wingers who are half space activators, who are basically attacking midfielders. I think we've seen that happen a lot this season. Teams like Crystal Palace have gone on great runs, and that's the exact kind of thing that Oliver Glasner has been using ever since he came in there. So having those wingers that are comfortable carrying inside, working inside, laying the ball off quickly and associating with other teammates, I think will be important for a lot of teams this year.
Yeah,
next year, sorry.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it is technically this year, next season. Yeah. But yeah, certainly this summer, I think those will definitely be the things that people are looking at. I think it's already been spoken about at various clubs. I know Ruben Amorim has spoken out already about the need for sort of left-footed tens in the right half space because of the passing angles that it opens up and the way that they can engage with wing backs and sort of having to have that balance. And I'm sure with what we assume will be Thomas Frank's Tottenham, there'll be sort of similar profiles being brought in there. That'll be really interesting to see how he sort of captures that. But the initial takeaway from me in terms of with my West Ham hat on and the profiles that you've just described is that if ever there was a clear outline of how important this summer is and how much work needs to be done, that's probably it, because you said how important physicality is in the middle of the park, but also how important decision making is. It's no wonder that Graham Potter has been talking about the need to overhaul the midfield, is it really, when you think about it? As much as I love Thomas Soucek and as much as I love the idea that he should stick around, I completely advocate for that. Speedy, ground covering, technical, none of those words are sort of what I would associate with Thomas Soucek or any of the midfielders really that we've got. Certainly not ticking all the boxes anyway. You've got some that are good at one thing, but that's not enough to really make a functioning midfield. So that'll be interesting, and I suppose will inform a lot of what we go on to discuss. And just to frame it, we're going to go from back to front. Really, we're going to split the pod into three sections. First, we'll look at the goalkeepers and defenders. Then we'll address the midfield, and then we'll assess the attack as well. But yeah, all this is to say really that there's been a lot of rumours, there's been a lot of links, and hopefully this sort of discussion, once we can sort of really nail down into the profiles rather than just would this player fit, would that player fit, can this player do what Potter wants, let's have a real honest conversation about actually what technical proficiencies do the players, whoever they might be, need to have, and then that'll really frame the discussions. And I think this week in Extra Time, which is the second part of this podcast that we do for our Patreon members, if you'd like to sign up, www.patreon.com/analyticsunited, and I always worry that I'm going to say that wrong, but this week we'll be discussing some of the championship players that have been linked, and hopefully it will segue really nicely from the main pod, because we'll already have an idea of the profiles that we're looking for as we go into the market, and whether the likes of Josh Brownhill or Hayden Hackney sort of tick those boxes. I'm not going to get into any of that on here because I've got a Patreon to ship. So if you want to come and get involved in those discussions, sign up. You do get a 7-day free trial, and we'll be doing all sorts of transfer chat throughout the summer. But yeah, this week we'll be looking at some championship talents that hopefully should tick those boxes, or perhaps, in the case of some of the link players, maybe not. Read into that what you want. But yeah, let's start at the back then. Big one for me, I think, in the context of West Ham, particularly given the departure of Lukasz Fabianski, is goalkeeper. We are definitely going to need to bring in one goalkeeper, I think, because I don't think it's likely that someone like Finlay Herrick is introduced into the sort of matchday squad, nor do I think we'll be keen to rely on Wes Foderingham as a backup number 2 when there's already question marks about how well Alphonse Areola can do the role that Graham Potter would like him to do in this system. So I suppose, quickly, Darcy, over to you. Without naming any names, as I say, profile-wise, goalkeeper, what are we looking for here? What are the crucial assets for a goalkeeper in this system as we see it? I should also say that system here, we're talking about the principles of Potter, whether it's a 3-4-3, a 3-4-2-1, a 3-5-2, a 4-3, whatever. I think the profiles are going to be the same. It's just where in the pitch they then line up. You're still going to need these profiles of player. And I think that's why it's a better way to look at squad building. Is you're not hamstringing yourself into one specific system. And I think even more important under someone like Graham Potter, right, who is known to sort of mix things up almost on a game-by-game basis. So thinking profile rather than position or player specifically is super important. So yeah, profile of goalie, what are we looking for?
Well, I think the key thing we've lost throughout this season, particularly under Potter, with the options we have in goal, is the level of control Potter would like to have. Like when the ball goes back to the goalkeeper, I think it's quite easy against West Ham to force a turnover or force a long ball, or just force some level of mistake that will then present the ball back to the opposition. So I think the shot stopping level, the stuff in the box, I actually think has been all right. It's been fine. So I don't think we're looking for any sort of an improvement on that would be great, of course, and welcomed, but it's not the key focus. Really, I think what we're looking for is obviously comfortability with the ball, but really it's within that, it's composure and intelligence in terms of the decisions being made with the ball. So we want the intelligence of play to understand when to play short. Like, is there a press breaking pass available? Is it better to hold the ball for a little bit and bait the press with a short pass to my left or right? And I think at the stage that we've shown we're at so far, the risk profile of that keeper doesn't need to be super high. It doesn't need to be like Edison, going longer still suits us to some degree. And it has to be balanced with the intelligence of when to go direct as well. Have we drawn the press forward and therefore there's space to go and exploit with a longer ball? It's that kind of improvement that I think will see one of the bigger effects via personnel on the team if we're able to sort out something like that.
And are there any sort of key? Obviously, I think goalkeepers, along with centre backs, are some of the most difficult to scout, really, both in terms of video and data. But especially with data, I think it's easy to look at shot stopping performance because you have things like post shot XG and stuff like that. But in terms of that tactical intelligence, which I think you're right to flag and probably is the most important thing, is that decision making. Are there any easier ways of speeding it up than basically just going, right, who's a good goalie and let me watch and see if he makes the decision that I would want him to make. I suppose my gut is to look at managers that are playing stylistically similar football and then whittle it down to, okay, within this list of teams that are playing in a slightly similar way, who are the best performing goalkeepers in those systems?
Yeah, I agree that that's probably the best way to do it. Obviously, there's certain parts of the data that you can use to inform that, but the data on goalkeepers isn't particularly extensive, nor do you often have like a metric that ties up the kind of thing we're looking for. You know, like when they play a line breaking pass, that's not necessarily a progressive pass, so you wouldn't be able to count that. So yeah, I think with you're right in your evaluation of it. It's a bit different with goalkeepers because I think it's quite important to watch them, see what situations they end up in, and if it's a keeper that's getting into relatively uncomfortable situations yet consistently making decisions that you're fine with them making, then you're kind of onto someone that seems decent. And obviously you can use the data to filter out that process. I'm not going to watch anyone that doesn't really use the ball or only goes long or has a really low pass success rate. But I think, yeah, watching keepers to understand decision making is key on the ball.
I think the only thing I would add as well that I would be looking for as we head into this summer, because it's been an area that I've often felt we've lacked at West Ham, but also that I think when we speak about tactical trends and sort of the way that teams tend to defend at the minute, it tends to be block up the middle of the pitch, make it difficult for teams to attack you through the middle, which then in turn often forces the opposition out wide, which in turn leads to lots of crosses into the box. And I think if that is the way that we are to defend, which I think is probably quite likely in a lot of times, particularly given one of our best duellers, Aaron Wan-Bissaka, is out on that flank, so it makes sense to push the danger out there and try and let our best defender deal with it. And also I think we have wingers that are quite good at tracking back as well and helping out Wan-Bissaka, particularly if Bowen's out on the flank. So if we're going to try and force the opposition into crossing rather than sort of penetrating us centrally, a goalkeeper who is comfortable coming off his line and claiming crosses would also be something that I would be particularly keen to look for, and something that you can pick out in the data depending on who your data provider is as well. But I think it's one of the reasons that Arsenal have been so good this season, because I think statistically for a few seasons now, David Raya has been the best in the Premier League for claiming crosses. And if you think of how good defensively Arsenal have been, then I think that is probably a huge factor in it. He's so dominant off his line. Cool. Okay, so a ball-playing keeper that's great off his line, good shot stopper. Yeah, not hard to find those. Definitely not expensive. But they are out there. They are out there. No, I was gonna drop his name, but Kevin Meyer. Go check out Kevin Meyer. That's the only transfer bite you're getting from me. I just love that guy, Kevin Meyer. What a bloke. But yeah, for any of that other stuff, do stick around and join the Patreon, like I say, and if you sign up soon. We recently did a discussion on some of the players at Chelsea that have been linked, and obviously Robert Sanchez had previously played under Graham Potter, and Jure Petrovic, who has had an amazing season at Strasbourg and is of course part of the Blue Co family, is apparently available because Chelsea have an abundance of goalkeepers and have already picked up Penders, who is a fantastic young goalkeeper in Belgium. So yeah, who knows what's going on there, but yeah, if he's available, maybe we should have a look. And if you want to hear my actual thoughts about those goalkeepers along with a few other Chelsea players, then it will be on the Patreon soon if it isn't already. On to centre-back. We don't know if we're going to play a back four or a back three, but we do know that we're going to need at least one centre-back, I think. Todibo's obviously coming in. We've paid that money. Whether he stays or goes, we don't know. Max Kilman will be a starter. Nyfagerd, everything suggests that he's going to be off. And then you've got Mavro, who question marks about whether Potter likes him or not. I think we've both stated previously that we would probably keep Mavro around as a squad option. I think he's the perfect backup. But whether you're playing a 2 or a 3, you're going to need that fourth centre-back. Whether they're a starter or not, we don't know. Profile-wise, again, I'm assuming that in the best case scenario, we would go for someone who ticks the physically dominant defensive dual monster box alongside the progressive box. And I suppose those are the two primary sort of profiles of defender, right? It's the sort of ball comfortable or the physically dominant. Virgil van Dijk is the premium asset who can do both. Otherwise, you often find squads that are more sort of akin to ours that have to try and bring in a few that tick all those boxes and then balance that defence out. If we accept that those are sort of the two ideal profiles or most common profiles in the Prem, Rather than say exactly which one, or say we need both. I suppose if you could only have one profile, and I assume we can't buy a Van Dijk, what profile would you be sort of looking for if we only make one centre-back signing this summer?
I would lean towards the more physically dominant, which I think probably says something about me and my own football values.
Oh, damn. I need a 5'11" king to come in here and do some Rabonas.
Yeah, but I think that in theory anyway, I know we haven't seen evidence of it this season. Well, we have in Max Kilman's case, and then Jean-Claude Todibo is also supposed to be very ball comfortable, and I'm hoping that's something we're going to see more of next season, and therefore I would prioritise that slightly more. But I think, and I like you said, I don't think it's useful to get bogged down in shape. But if we were to need a wide centre back, that player would need to be on the left. And if we were to need a wide centre back, I would maybe more emphasise the role of technical ability whilst still having a decent defensive level. But it's, there's more onus on the back line to be penetrative if you're playing a back three, because most likely anyway you have one less midfielder. So you need the help from the back line, and therefore I want someone a bit more technically comfortable. But in terms of addressing which half of that debate I think the squad needs more, it's probably the physically dominant.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think if you look at it on a squad level, if it is a back three, then you probably do have this player as a starter alongside Kilman, and Kilman will be the central centre-back because he's slightly more passive and has shown that he can do that. And if you're saying that he's slightly more passive, then you probably do want someone that's a little bit more aggressive, physical, defensive orientated, because if you're starting alongside Todibo and Kilman, then they've obviously both got that sort of ball comfortability. However, if you're playing a back four with two centre-backs, then it will probably be Kilman and Todibo, and then the left-footed centre-back could either be a backup to Kilman, which if you're playing him alongside Todibo or Mavropanos, then again, the progressive onus is taken by both of those, so it's less necessary. Or you might even play him at left-back in a sort of back four that shuffles into a three, and then you allow Wan-Bissaka to commit constantly on that right-hand side, and you sort of create a three-back that way. Either way, whichever way you cook it up in any of those situations, I think you're looking for primarily a left-footed centre-back, because Agurd's not likely to be around, Kilman's likely to be the starter, so whether that's a left-footed backup to Kilman, a left-footed physical person who can start at left-back, or a left-footed centre-back to play on the left of a back three, I think the one constant there is that it's left-back. And then I think finally, to wrap up this section where we cover goalkeepers and defence, it's the wing-back, full-back conundrum where we definitely are short. We've obviously got Wan-Bissaka, who is a nailed-on starter next season, and then question marks around Emerson and Scholes, I think. And then there's an obvious gap where Vladimir Sofal left. So profile-wise, I think this is a really interesting one, because I think we need to sort of realign, or I was about to say realign the chakras of the squad. That is not what we need to do, but maybe it would sort of sort the dressing room out. But certainly realign the balance of the squad in terms of sort of what our wing-backs offer, and sort of creating a little bit more consistency, I guess. I felt like every time we had to take Wan-Bissaka off and put Sofal in, as good a shift as he put in, it felt like the team changed, or had to change, because you can't ask him to do the same things that Wan-Bissaka does.
Yeah. I think really what you're saying there captures well what I think is the biggest problem, which is balance. There's just no balance, and there were certain games I've lost track now. Now that we're out of the season, but there was a couple of games towards the end of the season where teams, I think, specifically stopped us playing down Wan-Bissaka's side and tried to push the ball to the other side, and that's a direct symptom of when you haven't got the right balance on either wing. And I think we don't need a Wan-Bissaka copy on the other side, but we need someone who's, I think, technically proficient across the thirds, which Emerson is able to do, but then marries that up with, when they arrive in the final third, there's a level of final ball there, because I don't think Emerson or Scholes have that. I think Emerson can do some of it, which is why I'm not against him staying at all. But yeah, I think fullback, when we look at it in the way that we have today, fullback actually really stands out to me as like, we definitely need to address that. I know there's lots of players linked, so hopefully we will.
Yeah, I think so, and I think the another interesting one is around sort of the backup to Wan-Bissaka as well, or the second choice right back. It's do you even sort of need to go and get one, or can you sort of repurpose from a squad point of view someone like Somerville and just sort of have the idea that okay, Wan-Bissaka is the nailed-on starter, and if he's fit for every game, he plays every game. In a rare instance where Wan-Bissaka might not be available, across the squad, do we have enough to be able to just mix it up a little bit? And okay, maybe we've put a more defensive left back in that day, and we just put Somerville at right wing back. I think it's an interesting debate to be had about whether you even need to go out and do it. I personally would be in favour of just going and getting a right back, probably someone young, because I think to not go into this to go into the season as Somerville as your backup right wing back means that realistically you can never play a back four because you don't have a right back beyond Wan-Bissaka. Sure, you have Mavropanos, but I think that limits it as well, especially when you don't have then a crazy good left back because what you're playing Mavropanos at right back and then Emerson or Skulls in the left side of a back four, the balance is way off. So yeah, I think addressing the balance there is super important. Somewhere else that really needs to have the balance addressed, maybe even more so than the defence, is the midfield, and that will be what we come back to discuss after this break. Okay, midfield next. I think this is the part of the squad that creates the biggest issues for me going into the summer, in part because I think profile-wise, as we say, I think it needs a massive overhaul anyway. My big concern is our midfield is bad in spite of the fact that we actually have so many players in these positions, and I think anything that we do is kind of contingent on us being able to shift some of these to sort of bring the size of the squad down without having to add in profiles on top of profiles that just don't really work. So I suppose before we look at the profiles that we need to bring in, what profiles do we have, and why hasn't it worked?
Well, why it hasn't worked is because the profiles are mismatched with the they're from a time long gone. Let's say they once worked and now they do not. Really, if we're looking at the most basic level, the most basic level, sorry. What Potter wants in his midfielders, technicians, and players that show game intelligence, midfield intelligence. They recognise and then exploit tactical conditions. The group of midfielders that we've accumulated and built over the last couple of years win games through essentially physical dominance and then having really high upside in certain moments, i.e. Thomas Souček in either box, and then between the boxes super physical. James Ward-Prowse really physical in terms of his ground coverage in that attacking mid spot under Moyes, and then the upside you get from him from dead balls. Even Edson Alvarez, to a certain extent, when you create the correct conditions for him, can have really high upside defensively. But now those are not the things that are being leaned into by the system. And therefore, I essentially, the technical level of the midfield is too low. The ability to cover ground is way too low. And we're seeing a lot of the problems, or all of the problems we've seen in midfield this season, really are underpinned by, I think, those two or three key things.
Who do you think survives, like profile-wise? I assume we're not going to get rid of our entire midfield because that would kind of be crazy. So let's assume some players stick around. Who do you think those players are, and what would your reason be for keeping them, if that makes sense? Like, what do they offer to the squad that means that they shouldn't be shipped out?
So Souček is the obvious one that stays for me. Just because he dominates in both boxes, which I just don't think any team can say that isn't valuable. So there's always a space for someone that can do that. And I think in terms of like midfield tactical intelligence, exploiting conditions, he's probably the best of the midfield crop outside of like a Paquetá, but I'm not even sure you'd include him in there. And it's just his technical level, which is a letdown, but that doesn't mean that he can be useful in, or he isn't useful in a variety of conditions and would be useful in certain game states or even to start certain games. So I'd definitely be keeping him. And then James Ward-Prowse, I think, lacks in the physicality aspect in terms of like being a dueling midfielder, even if he can cover ground well, but also provides the midfield intelligence intelligence and then a decent technical level as well. It's not that his technical ceiling is really high. I think it's more that his floor is really high. Like, you're always going to get a certain level out of James Ward-Prowse, and I think it's enough for Potter to work with. Outside of that, I would say
anyone
I would consider, I would consider anyone going. That youth players aside,
of course,
Lewis Orford is not on my shopping block. Don't worry, everyone.
Okay, so I suppose that leaves, and I think I would agree with that, actually. I don't know necessarily that either one of Souček or Ward-Prowse would be in my starting 11 next season if I had everything my way. However, I think they both have utility in certain game states, as you say, and in certain matches. And I also think, again, as we say, we're not trying to build a squad where we have two options for every position on the pitch in a specific shape, let's say a 3-4-3. What we're trying to do is build a squad that has profiles of a balanced enough nature that a manager, whether it's Potter or perhaps even more importantly when it comes to squad planning, whether it's someone else because it doesn't go right with Potter, a balanced squad that someone could come in and go, okay, there's enough profiles here for me to play my way without having to do all of this surgery, which we've had to do time and time again when new managers have come in. So I think it is about that. And I think Ward-Prowse and Souček, like you say, they are never to be seen in a midfield two on their own together in the middle of the park, hopefully. However, if for one game you're going to play a 5-3-2 or a 4-3-3 and you've got three central midfielders in there, all of a sudden they become a lot more useful because you can sort of mask over some of the deficiencies by having that extra body in there, which I think is a really useful weapon to have, because like you say, if you're playing a three-man midfield and all of a sudden you introduce Thomas Souček's threat in both boxes and you just take one of the centre-backs out, all of a sudden, as long as you put the relevant pieces around it to sort of make it function, then that is a really threatening option. But I suppose if we're accepting that neither of them really are likely to be starters in our ideal midfield department next season, what then is the ideal profile? I assume, based on sort of, if I'm picking up what you've been putting down, then we need someone that can cover ground, ideally at a much faster rate than both Souček and Ward-Prowse. Someone that ideally can receive sort of 360 degrees, that's comfortable sort of receiving back to goal, comfortable receiving on the half turn, comfortable receiving mid-stride. Not necessarily the same player. This is sort of, you could balance a midfield two out by having one person that excels at one and one person that excels at the other. So I think in my head it's probably, you go and bring in sort of a ground covering, more sort of defensive minded sort of ball winner, disruptor, interceptor, whatever you want to call it, that sort of maybe sits a little bit deeper, and then you've got more of a technician who can sort of get up and get involved in the final third, take on a bit more of the progressive burden. This is the player that can receive 360. This is the player that's a really good scanner of the pitch, able to pick up the ball in pockets of space and help us with that sort of transition from first to second phase of build-up, but then also be able to help us get from second into third. I assume that's sort of where we're at. Obviously not super easy to do. But is there anything else you think we've missed in terms of blending that midfield profile? I'm also working on the assumption that you probably want 5 options in midfield, one of them being a youth player, I guess, or someone that's more of a peripheral figure, because then you have the freedom to play a 2-man midfield or a 3-man midfield, and you've still got the subs on the bench.
Yeah, no, I think you've covered everything pretty well. The only thing I'd highlight is for our deeper midfielder, for the number 6, basically one of the more defensive midfield profiles we bring in. Ball security is a really important thing. Yeah. I think we already get that through Guido Rodriguez. We just don't get any of the other stuff. But actually being able to receive, not even necessarily 360, it doesn't have to be, that on the turn nimble 8 at all. But yeah, being able to use the ball well, sort of in the way that James Ward-Prowse does in deep areas and relieve pressure, I think is really important, and not to lean too heavily just into the destroyer profile, because I think some of those players can be very wayward, and as much as they're good at making lots of tackles, they also invite pressure, and we have enough pressure inviting midfielders in the squad already, I think.
Yeah. So I suppose a slightly more secure number 6 and a slightly more progressive, agile number 8 would be a nice balance. But I think profile-wise, it's you kind of, the way I look at midfield, it's like you have a checklist of all the things a midfield should have, and then as long as across the two of them, every box is ticked by one of them, then you're sort of in an ideal position. But I think perhaps most important, at least in the context of our midfield, is raising that technical ceiling, but also like just making sure that we've got legs in there. Like I can't be seeing next season the amount of times I've seen Edson Alvarez have to run back and try and cover ground that he just shouldn't have to do, but we've got no one else to do it. So just more sort of athleticism, I guess, above anything. And I suppose one player that we have been linked to, and again, I'm not going to go into it in crazy amounts of detail, but Rafael Onyedika is a player that's been really strongly rumoured, and I think he would certainly tick a few of these boxes. And again, he's another player that we have covered over on the Patreon this season. So if you want to hear a lot more about him, but also a few of the other players in Belgium and Denmark that we've been linked to, go check it out, because frankly, there's a few names that we've been linked to that I'm really excited about and have been for a while. Whether Onyedika is one of those, you'll have to sign up and go and find out for yourselves. But yeah, I think there's going to be plenty more midfield targets that get linked. I suppose the other area of midfield that sort of can act as a bit of a bridge into part 3 of this section, this podcast rather, where we'll discuss wingers and forwards, is that attacking midfielder slot. I think it depends almost entirely on what system you play as to where the attacking midfielder goes. Are they an 8? Are they a 10? But really, every squad, regardless of whether you play a 4-2-3-1, a 3-4-3, whatever, you're going to need someone who is sort of your primary creative hub. I think Paquetá has been this for us at times. Do I think he's super consistent and reliable? Not really. Do I think he'll play for us next season? Again, not entirely sure. But what was your feelings about Paquetá heading into next season, and sort of more generally what this sort of creative fulcrum, I guess, looks like sort of in the universe of Graham Potter?
Yeah, in terms of Paquetá, I've almost had to sort of like I've had my own journey with Paquetá this season where I've kind of accepted that, because I did think for a long time that he is this really high level creator, and like if he went to City, you'd see his numbers explode and whatever. But I think what we've seen this season is a lot of those assumptions are not necessarily true. There's certain things that he's really, really good at. So he progresses the ball in quite a risky fashion, but finds passes that cause the maximum damage to the opposition. He's really good at identifying weak spots, and he's good at finding passes into the box, but he isn't a high volume chance creator at all, and he never has been for West Ham. And fundamentally, I think that's the balance that we're missing in our attack a lot of the time. We've got so many players that are focused on goals, and not enough that I think are purely focused as attackers on creating goals. And if Paquetá could raise his level and fill the attacking midfield spot for us, and I mean raise his level as a creator, not raise his overall level, because I think he ended the season quite well when he was involved. But if he can't, and we're sort of accepting that isn't his profile, I think he's probably seen more as one of the midfield quartet rather than the attackers. And you asked about Graham Potter as well, right? And how attacking midfielders would work with Graham Potter. Sometimes those guys are the wingers, essentially. So the wingers move inside, and therefore we would maybe be looking at a more creative winger, which I imagine we'll talk a little bit about in the third and final part.
Well, I was going to do a lovely segue, but it sounds like you've actually done it for me. So yeah, I'll meet you there, and we'll come back to discuss wingers and forwards. So, wingers and forwards next, which I think opens up a pretty interesting debate, because so much of it is contingent on whether Mohamed Kudus is here. I think we can assume that he's not going to be. What we can't assume is that we're going to get loads of money for him, because that seems to be the sticking point at the minute. And then the other question mark is A, is Lucas Paquetá still here? And B, as we were just discussing in the second part of the pod, what is Lucas Paquetá if he is still here? Is he an 8? Is he a 10? Is a 10 a winger in a Graham Potter system? So there's so much debate. What there is no debate about is Jarrod Bowen. He's going to start. And I think this really informs the question around what profile of winger do we need if we are to bring a winger in.
Yeah, I think it's kind of what we were hinting at in part two, where we need someone who is explicitly creative, someone who is gonna not it's not that we're not bothered about goal output at all. It's that we need someone to be a creator first. You know, you look at Kudus and you look at Bowen, they're shoot on sight, shoot first. They're not looking to play the pass across the goal. If they don't have to, they want the goal themselves, which is absolutely fine, and it's benefited both of them across their careers at West Ham. But we need someone who's going to look to feed those guys. I mean, there's a very strong argument that, you know, you put Paquetá back to the left wing spot. He's not just going to become this high volume creator overnight, but it definitely does improve his creative outlook, or at least it did under David Moyes. And maybe with more of the ball, we would see that improve. I also think there's strong arguments to be made for both seeing Somerville in that role. It's one of the things he was really good at in the Championship. Still got goals, but was also good at generating shots for teammates. And Louis Guilherme as well. I think it's more than fair to consider that he could be the creative guy. I mean, he looks super fluid in the middle of the pitch and wants to make those associative moments with the midfielders happen as much as he can. And that's the exact kind of thing that we're missing. Sort of half space activation is something that Kudus and Bowen, neither of them are good at. And I actually think we have lots of options in Paquetá, Guilherme and Somerville to sort of address that. So I'm maybe not as worried about the winger spot as kind of the loss of a key player would normally make someone. Because I actually think there's a lot of options in-house to sort of address it. It doesn't mean that we might not need to, especially if Somerville's injury is more long-standing than we assume. I'm kind of assuming he'll be back by around the start of the season. But yeah, it's one that doesn't worry me as much as something like fullback or the midfield, for example.
Yeah, maybe this is the first piece of evidence for West Ham pivoting towards half-decent squad planning. We bought Luis Guilherme and Crescencio Somerville before Kudus was even on the table, and now that he's gone, both of the options as his backups are in-house. That doesn't mean that we don't have to go and sign someone, because I think, like you say, the real question for me is, if Paquetá goes, then what do you replace him with profile-wise? I think if Kudus goes and Paquetá stays for whatever reason, which we're not led to believe will happen, but if it does, then I don't think I would bother with a winger signing, because I think I would just back, between the three of them, Somerville, Guilherme and Paquetá, I would back one of them to hit the sort of creative output brief, if we gave them enough opportunity to show that, obviously. And I also think, if, like I say, if Paquetá's here, then signing another winger on top of that when you've still got so much work to do in midfield, more importantly, I would say, in terms of profiles, like there's so much more work to be done there. I think you're just creating more work for yourself. You're reducing the sort of spread of your budget, because you're having to spread it across one extra player who you're trying to bring in. And realistically, if you are bringing in an attacking midfielder or a winger, it's going to be someone to address that creative burden, which is therefore going to cost a lot of money. So I think, yeah, with regards to profile, I think it's clearly someone who is create first, score second, I think. But I also think that could be Somerville, it could be Guilherme, and I think if it's Paquetá in a left sort of 10 role that oscillates between winger and 10 depending on the system, we will at least see an improvement on what he brings. If Paquetá and Kudus go, then I would go and just sort left winger by XA and then work out who sits out at the top, because I really think as well the knock-on implication that it has on Bowen, if you go and take some of that creative burden off him, like obviously he's laid on a lot of assists this season and that's been great, and I don't want to lose that from his game, but I think if you pair Bowen with someone in that left wing slot who is a more consistent creator, you see Bowen getting on the end of the chances that creator has put on a plate for him more often, which can only be a good thing. The next question, which is kind of topical, I suppose, with the news that comes today about Antonio's contract situation, is who are our options up front next season? And again, both of the options that we have in-house at the moment, Antonio and Nicholas Füllkrug, may or may not be here this time next season, right? So I think, I don't know what the market is for Füllkrug. It seems as though if something were to come in terms of an offer, that we probably would entertain it. But I think my inclination is that I I don't think anyone would pay necessarily what I would want to receive for Nicholas Füllkrug, and therefore I think you keep him around as a squad option, because I think profile-wise, he's kind of like Souček for me. Like it's not someone I necessarily would bank on to start, but in certain games, I think it's really useful to have because I think you can rely on him to do a very specific thing very well. I'm not saying profile-wise they're similar. I think Füllkrug is technically actually so much better than people give him credit for. I think it's actually more of the fact that I don't know if Füllkrug will ever be able to do a full 90 again at the level. I think he could probably stay on the pitch for 90 minutes, but by 70 plus, he's not the player that he was in the first 10 minutes. And I just think trying to build a starting 11 where your main guy up top isn't able to play 90 minutes consistently is a fool's errand. And I think it seems like Antonio will go. Whether you think that's the right thing or not is not a debate that I'm wanting to entertain on here. Either way you look at it, whichever one of them goes out the door, you're very short up top. So as a striker, what sort of profile are you looking at? We've already been linked to quite a few names. Lucas Stassin. I saw some Imega links. I think the lad at Sunderland as well. I can't remember his name, but the one thing I thought when I was looking at all of these links was, I'm not sure how similar all of these players are profile-wise, and I wonder if we actually know what we want up top yet. So assume you're Carl Macaulay. What are you looking for as a profile? I suppose as well, part of it is like, what is the complement to Füllkrug? Like, if I'm saying Füllkrug's a nice option, do you just try and get another guy that can do what Füllkrug does, or do you try and balance it out by sort of bringing in some of the things that he can't do?
Yeah, I think it's difficult with Füllkrug because I actually think a lot of his profile like overlaps with one where the overall like Premier League centre forward meta is going, but two with some of what Potter would want, more so like around the box, his link up play, things like that. I think really what I'd be looking for in another striking option is to maybe not give up all of that physicality, but focus more on technical ability. So when I think of a Potter striker, I think of someone who is more open to dropping deep and associating, isn't necessarily super goal focused. Goals are obviously important, but I think it's a lot more important that they're technically fluid and technically secure. And obviously if you compare that with like physicality, for some reason the only profile that's popping to mind is like Karim Benzema is obviously a great example of that, physical and technical. I was going to say Joshua Zirkzee, he's just because he's 6'4".
I've thought about it, I have thought about whether we could make Zirkzee work in a Potter system, but I think the Potter system is not actually a million miles removed from a Ruben Amorim system, so certainly in terms of shape anyway, and what he wants his nines to do.
But yeah, I think you're looking for that more mobile presence up front. Someone that's, and I don't mean with the ball, I mean someone that's going to kind of like move around between the lines to receive, and then be able to do something with it when they do receive. And Füllkrug can do that, but he's not, he's not going to turn and then carry the ball. I know we have seen him do that actually quite impressively a couple of times this season. Don't think that's repeatable. I think that was a lot more situationally driven. So yeah, I think maybe dialing up the technical ability and an ability to link up with midfield, and maybe for that trading off some level of physicality.
Yeah, well, if anyone wants to hear anything about someone that might meet that brief, we've been linked to Mathias Kvistgaarden of FC Brøndby, a young Danish striker who I've been banging on about for a good while now. He is only 5'8", so there are some serious question marks about how that translates to the Premier League, but technically he's a good player, and yeah, we spoke quite a bit about him over on the Patreon in a recent transfer wrap we've done. So yeah, if you want to hear a bit more about how I think that may or may not translate, then go over there. But yeah, the idea of being linked to a 5'8" striker in a season where we're talking about how how the focal point 9 was in vogue is interesting. However, the season ended with PSG winning the Champions League with a false 9 up top, and lots of discussions about whether strikerless formations are actually back in. So maybe we don't really need a big physical brute up there. Maybe we need someone to drop in, drag defenders out of the way for Jared Bowen to get in behind and score the goals for us. The Bobby Firmino to Bowen's Mohamed Salah, if you will. And that could be something that works really nicely. So yeah, it's an interesting one. I'm kind of in the camp that I wouldn't necessarily go and spend huge amounts of money on a striker this summer, because I think you've got a prolific goal scorer in Bowen, and a squad really, or certainly a squad of our level, only really needs one prolific goal scorer. So yeah, I think you probably find someone that can go and maximise Bowen's strengths rather than trying to find someone that can bang 25 goals a season, because I don't think we need that. We're not trying to qualify for the Well, I suppose every club's trying to qualify for the Champions League, but realistically, we're not aiming for that. And Bowen giving us 20 goals a season is more than enough if you can get a few players that chip in with 10 goals, but also 10 assists for the rest of the season. So, yeah, I really wouldn't be against just getting a striker that can really be a nice complement to that attacking three and sort of make it really work in harmony, which I think it hasn't necessarily done yet. But I think there's certainly ways to do that. And I think that's everything. I think we've covered every position and sort of the profiles that we need. And ultimately, the conclusion that we've come to is that we need a goalkeeper, a centre-back, a wing-back, a defensive midfielder, a central midfielder, maybe an attacking midfielder / winger, and a striker. So if ever there was a good advert for signing up to the Patreon where we specialise in scouting players and discussing good fits for the squad, that should be it. Because we've got a hell of a lot of work to do this summer, Darcy. And you'll all be very pleased to know that we've been working on some fun stuff in the background, coding our own apps to find players, doing our own scouting work, building our own systems, and we've got a lot of players on a lot of shortlists that we're excited to talk about. So if you want to hear about who they are, sign up. Thanks everyone for sticking around to the end and hearing what we think of the West Ham squad as we head into what is set to be a bonkers summer, I'm sure. Then yeah, do go and sign up, and we will be discussing this week on Extra Time, which we're going to record in just a few minutes, all of the Championship players that have been linked to us in the last few weeks, including a certain Josh Brownhill and how he fits or doesn't fit the profile of midfielder that we need. Should be an interesting discussion. So see you there. Thank you, Darcy. As always, I'm kind of excited for the summer, but I don't know if that's just because I'm a sicko that loves scouting players from random leagues. It suits me, man. It suits me.